Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast. I'm your host, Member of Parliament, Garnet Jenis. Our Alberta Conservative Party caucus recently had a very powerful meeting in Jasper, Alberta. We were there to connect with the community and to learn about the enduring impacts and challenges following the devastating fire that ripped through the town in the summer of last year. Now, one clear message we got that I want to start with off the top is that Jasper is open. If you're planning a family vacation anytime, do look at Jasper as a possible option. It's obviously a beautiful place, and moreover, revitalizing the town needs to involve a return of tourists like you. This remains an amazing place to visit, to take in the natural beauty, and also maybe to learn a little bit about the subjects we're going to talk about, which are fire prevention, and recovery. So I wanted to do an episode on the situation in Jasper overall. I know that many Canadians were following last summer and were moved by what they saw, but also these things tend to fall out of the news, and our attention is grabbed by another crisis or other problems before the original situation is actually solved. So in the meantime, while maybe people have been focused on other events that have happened since, the community of Jasper has continued to have to do the work of responding and rebuilding. On today's episode, we have a couple of different guests with different kinds of expertise that will help us understand what happened in Jasper and what needs to happen going forward. So first off, I'm joined by Dane de Souza, who is perfectly positioned to give us some perspective on fire management and fire prevention. So Dane, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation.
No, thank you so much for having me, Garnet. I appreciate the opportunity.
Great. So I wonder if you could start by just sharing a bit about your background and experience as it relates to fires and firefighting, and then a bit of kind of how that relates to the background of the Jasper fire.
I first kind of got introduced to wildfire in 2013. That was my first year working as a wildland firefighter for the government of Alberta. I was a Hell Attack wildland firefighter from 2013 till 2019, based out of Shunda Fire Base in the Rocky Mountain House District. So that's literally sandwiched right in between Banff and Jasper. So during my career, I fought fires from the Yukon to southern Alberta to Idaho to Ontario out to BC. And in my home district, had the unique experience of getting a lot of experience in mountain fire. In particular on the Spreading Creek fire, which was very similar to the Jasper fire. That was in 2014. And then in 2019, I did a Master's of International Forestry at the University of British Columbia, where I was looking into Indigenous fire stewardship and Indigenous fire stewardship techniques as a climate solution, and how they can be mobilized to kind of deal with some of the wildfires that we've been seeing in the past 20 years. So my background, I am Indigenous. I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Family names are Sutherland and Sinclair from the Selkirk area. So since then, a lot of my work is focused on researching the connection between the Métis and Indigenous peoples and human beings as a whole, and fire and putting good fire on the land.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's good background, and I think it's going to really inform the conversation we're gonna have. And to your point on Indigenous fire stewardship, so I think that was the background to the very kind of vivid picture you presented us, just about saying, okay, we've got these fires now, but let's think about, and you challenged us to think about kind of the relationship between human beings, landscape, and fire going back thousands of years and what we can learn from that experience. So I'd love for you to just share with our audience what was really captivating for me, which was this kind of historical context for understanding relationships between people, fire, and land.
Yeah, so it's a history that really goes back 500,000 years, but we'll focus on the 14,000 years. If any of your listeners have read the book Sapiens or any kind of other anthropological work that talks about how you can track the migration of humans historically. In those works, they talk about how you can track the migration of humans from the extinction of megafauna, so things like giant mammoths and giant sloths. And what you'd really think usually is that we hunted them to extinction or it was disease. But one thing that is very characteristic of all human beings, no matter where we've gone on this planet, is we modify our environments to suit our needs and our place within those environments. And the tools that we've used for the longest and most effectively to do that has been fire. So when you think of fire 500,000 years ago, I'm not talking about a couple cavemen sitting around and cooking up some harvest of some kind. I'm talking about fire being applied to the land to act as a bulldozer, a fertilizer, to coax animals out of grazing territories. Between Calgary and Banff alone, the Mountain Legacy Project has identified over 100 different uses for applying fire to the land pre-colonialism. So how that kind of applies to a modern context is if you think about what is currently Canada, roughly 14,000 years ago, that was under a kilometer-thick sheet of ice known as Laurentide glaciers. As it started receding, every single inch of the way, human beings were there. Indigenous peoples, our ancestors, human beings were there, and their fire was there. And they were using fire every single inch of that way. Every time a new tree would sprout out or a new landscape would sprout out from that glacier, those lands were being burned and managed and stewarded. And over time, the genetics of every tree, plant, and animal have come to know those fires and the people who stewarded them. And that has set a rhythm in the boreal forest. It's set a rhythm through all the forests in Canada of how a forest life cycle works. So to kind of fast forward, we get to about 200 years ago where the first laws banning Indigenous fire stewardship were passed. And that was done in the interest of protecting colonial extraction of forest resources. But that wasn't really enforceable until about 40 years ago. So if you can think of the forest right now, the boreal forest, if you've ever been up in a helicopter or a plane above it, it's an unbroken sea of trees. And as a fire rolls through that unbroken sea of trees, it's like a wave. And it just continues to gain energy and more energy until it becomes completely unstoppable. Now, if you think of that same forest 200 years ago, and you were burning over here 10 years ago for moose to come graze, or then over here you burnt a portage 10 to 15 years ago, so it was easier to get between rivers, and then some berry patches over here. As that tidal wave comes through, it hits those different pockets and islands of recently burned forests that aren't going to burn again. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it loses in intensity. In a modern context, that means you're saving communities. In a historical context, that means you have a healthier forest. What we're seeing now with some of these fires that are occurring, like the Lytton fire, is they are occurring at such a heat and temperature with so much energy that they're starting to destroy the little critters, the microbiota that exist in the forest to restart the growth of a forest. So very long-winded way of saying, by taking fire off the land and turning to suppression, we've created a situation in which we have completely unmanageable, unstoppable fires that there's absolutely no way to respond to.
It's really interesting, your description, because it does seem to suggest this sort of tension in worldview, right? I think that a lot of us would have encountered the kind of environmental worldview that sees people and fires as necessarily having a negative influence, right? Like that the ideal of pristine nature is the people are away from it, maybe looking at it from a distance, and nothing's burning. And you're articulating a kind of very different worldview about that relationship. You're saying, hey, the presence of people using fire is a natural part of these systems. So actually, when you have this this idealization of the people and fire-free landscape removed from it, that you're creating more problems. Have I given a good kind of summary of that?
Yeah, definitely. I think in the past 200 or 400 years, where Canada has moved to industrialization and urbanization, we create these cities and they cause a disconnect between us and nature. Like, I grew up in Calgary. It wasn't until my first time standing in front of a 60-foot wall of flame that I kind of felt like, oh, nature, right?
Right.
Here's my place in nature. It's not at the top of the Calgary Tower. It's It's a very humbling experience, but it's also exactly that. Is as humans, we're very much a part of nature, and only more recently have we started to move away from that. And beyond that, I mean, when it comes to fire, this image of all fires being bad, that's propagated by a shirtless bear who says only you can prevent wildfires and all wildfires need to be prevented. It is true, only we can prevent wildfires of a magnitude that we can't control or live with, and that's by putting good fire on the land. It's a weird irony.
And it's fascinating, but I think your description of the kind of cultural changes. We're in this country which is incredibly vast, wild, large, and yet most Canadians live in cities. Right, the majority of our population is urban, and we have a deep sort of psychological, emotional relationship with the land, with nature. We love it, but we don't live on it and in it in the same way that people did at one time in the past. So what you're describing is I think going to challenge a lot of people's assumptions that what's best for nature is to be left alone versus how people living on the land and using it actually has come to be necessary for those ecosystems to thrive.
Yeah, I think there's a very interesting component of truth and reconciliation at play here. I think, there is this cognitive dissonance in Canada between urban and rural. And beyond that, there's this kind of misunderstanding that like Indigenous peoples of Canada were found naked and afraid and wanting for the help of Europeans. Now, every time I fly over the prairies in the winter, I go, oh my God, I wouldn't last 2 minutes down there. How did my ancestors last, 14,000 plus years down there? There are histories of great resilience and understanding in these spaces. And currently, the Canadian approach to truth and reconciliation is we only reconcile a very small portion of the truth. We are trying our best to reconcile residential schools and cultural and actually straight up genocide. And that's a tough thing to do because it's very guilt driven. But I think what's the remarkable part of this is when you start looking into the truths that existed before colonialism, the truths of Indigenous fire stewardship, the truths of how to manage landscapes and ecosystems and steward them as such that you could have cultures and populations and diversity on these landscapes and live within them and thrive within them. There's an opportunity there that Canadians can gather around, whole of society can gather around and reconcile those truths and do it out of pride. I've often said when I've spoken at the UN or different forums in Ottawa, that in Canada, we don't have a haka. Anybody who's ever watched a rugby game or heard of rugby knows like the New Zealand All Blacks, they have the haka, that Maori war dance, where it doesn't matter if they're in Auckland or if they're in France, people stand up and they respect that and they celebrate it. In Canada, we haven't quite found our way to that yet. But I think that things like Indigenous fire stewardship could be that. It's fascinating. It's interesting. It has benefits and knowledge that can be shared and taken part of by anybody who's out on the land. And it can actually help to reconcile those truths that go beyond just, the past 200 years, that reconcile the truths of 14,000 plus years.
Yeah. So these are fascinating big ideas, and let's kind of bring them into the immediate context of the Jasper fire. So what you're describing is how there's a knowledge and experience about people using fire, living on the land, and I guess in more in common terminology, essentially that created fire breaks, right? That created spaces which prevented fire from gaining momentum, and it created a more healthy cycle of limited but controlled fire that prevented the kind of catastrophes that we've seen. That knowledge was ignored or not implemented, and as a result, you had a situation, from what I understand, where there was just a massive accumulation of, and some of this was pine beetle as well. There was this massive accumulation of people call the tinderbox, essentially, and then that led to this huge fire that caused a lot of damage for the town. That's kind of how the one leads to the other. Do I have that picture broadly correct, or?
Yeah, and I think it ties back to the point earlier of these worldviews that aren't really compatible with the landscape.
Right.
Jasper is a microcosm of a lot of what we see throughout the boreal forest, where I would urge anybody listening to this to look at the Mountain Legacy Project, because it compares the glass slides of pictures taken of Jasper in 1915, which was 10 years after the last Indigenous families were kicked out of the park in the name of conservation. And then it compares those slides with modern day, and they're completely different landscapes. And like you said, it went from this landscape mosaic where you have prairies and meadows and all different kinds of things to, like you've said, the tinderbox. So that is a microcosm of something that we've seen all across the boreal forest, where a Eurocentric worldview of how to manage forests and landscapes has replaced the worldview and the science and the knowledge and the systems that have stewarded those lands for 14,000 years.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you specifically about the concept of traditional knowledge, because this is something that I think people will have heard used a lot in politics. People say verbally, they affirm the idea of traditional knowledge. But what you're talking about is it's real traditional knowledge. It's people that have lived on the land who understand it, and their experience was ignored, and it led to problems. What's the gap in terms of, like, now people starting to talk about traditional knowledge, but not implement it? And I guess maybe just put a definition. Traditional knowledge, as I understand it, it's knowledge that is accumulated based on experience of a people over a long period of time. So it's something that people have tested, experimented with, and come to know over sort of the history of a culture, rather than something that you just discovered in the short term. And traditional knowledge is scientific because it's based on experience and experimentation. But yeah, I'm just curious for your thoughts on how we understand traditional knowledge and what the gap is in actually implementing it.
Yeah, I think traditional knowledge is something I struggle with quite a bit, because I had to go to the University of British Columbia to have somebody say, this guy understands science. And I think of all the hoops that I had to jump through in life to get there, and all of the fortunate things I had to have in life in order to get there. I had a wonderful upbringing where education was always at the forefront, and I found my passion when I was 21, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, okay, my knowledge was validated. But you said it yourself, like, if science is the process of trial and error, testing hypotheses, and then replicating experiments, it is a very human thing to be doing. We've been doing that far beyond when, universities, the oldest universities are only 1,000 years old, but as human beings, we've been doing that for 500,000 years plus. So traditional knowledge, I'd say, has a very similar parallel to, let's take a farmer, for example. You go ask a farmer, what's your land saying? And they'll say, well, out here, there's where the coyote den is, and over here, we're not getting that much rain this year, and there's wind exposure here, so we have to plant this, and yada, yada. It's all very landscape-based. It's all very, very contextual. It's all very salient, and takes a long term and applies it in a short term, and it's reactive. That's traditional knowledge right there. It's 14,000 years of being on the ground, knowing what's going on. Wildfires are very landscape contextual phenomena. They're, a good wildland firefighter can smell and taste and hear a fire changing. I think of being on a traditional burn. We were there with the Banff crew, who are some of the best firefighters on the planet. It's guys I've worked with forever. And I was there with a Métis elder who's been fighting fires for 50 years. And the Banff crew, we had a printout, and we went through the science. Okay, yeah, we got a head fire intensity of this and blah, blah, blah. And these conditions give us this, this, and this. Okay, we checked the box. Great, let's go do a burn. And we all did the exact same thing without talking about it. And this is just being wildland firefighters. This is being boots on the ground. We each went to a different corner of that field, picked up some grass, rubbed it in our hands, smelled it, threw it into the wind. And then came back into the field, center of the field, and it was, all right, Dane, what's going on in your corner? well, I could smell a little bit of dew in the grass, and the way the shadows are tracking, I don't think it will dry out till about 3 p.m. So we'll probably have to wait. What about your corner? Well, it's exposed to this wind, so we'll experience kind of a fire behavior of this, that, and the other. That's traditional knowledge.
Yeah.
We did not need some scientists to tell us what that fire was going to do from a laboratory or a weather station X kilometers away. That's a great help. But when it's combined with that boots on the ground traditional knowledge, that understanding that's very human and applicable, that's where you get successful results.
Yeah, I think to people who hear that terminology initially, traditional knowledge, it can seem very like distant and abstract, and it's important to just make it concrete. You're right. It's the accumulated knowledge that an Indigenous community has about land, but it's also the farmer family's been farming for generations, and he knows the land. He knows, I think it's when people go to their grandparents for advice about life, right? There's all these different ways of understanding, which we draw on our heritage and understanding things, and we're connected to place.
I think where it differs from Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, is it's codified and passed down in such a way that it's cultural. So Western science, you have to jump through all the hoops you need to go get a master's degree. But in Indigenous knowledge and science, like let's say if you have a learning disability, you're not going to get to a master's degree, chances are. Yeah. But if you can learn through storytelling, through application, through doing, through all these different ways that knowledge is passed down, it becomes something that the whole of society, like everybody in the community can buy into and have a part of, as opposed to, I had to climb the ivory tower of education for people to listen to me. Mm-hmm. But my real bread and butter is I've actually gone and stood in front of the fire you see behind me right now.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you though on this issue, like help me understand the gap between the knowledge that exists and the policymakers putting it into action, because like I hear policymakers talk about traditional knowledge, and yet this is a concrete example of a failure to learn from that knowledge of how decisions made in Ottawa are profoundly disconnected from the realities on the ground, and there haven't really been the kinds of policy changes that it sounds like you would like to see that take a different view of people and fire on the land. So why do you think it's happening that that the conversation in Ottawa seems to have been shifting, but the decision is if anything moving in the wrong direction?
I think when it comes to wildfire and policymaking in general, and this is something that Ottawa is a bit to blame, but provinces really set the tone, and I would say Alberta, the management and politicization of wildfire in Alberta in the past 5 to 10 years here has been absolutely horrific. But what it has really taught me is that if you do the right thing when it comes to wildfire management and you prevent wildfires, no one knows you did it. And if no one knows you did it, you can't take credit for it. So if you go and slash a wildfire budget in Alberta and put young folks out, no jobs, no experience, there's no career advancement, sure, you can tell the taxpayer you saved them a dime, but then you're going to go take a photo with South Africans who had to import and pay hundreds of dollars per day when you could have just kept that money in the pockets of wildland firefighters who don't even get presumptive health care for cancer and the things that they're exposed to, let alone year-round employment. Where it is done right, though, Banff National Park, their wildfire crew has been able to develop a culture and a system of having folks who are year-round. They're all like, to be a rookie, you have to have 10 years experience on that crew, because that's the culture. They all have degrees in forestry or fire ecology, and that's where it's been gotten right. And I'm not entirely sure what Banff has done to enable that to happen, but where the opportunity is for parks and policymakers and for Ottawa to get this right and show a model that provinces in the entire world can learn from is empowering those folks at a ground level to connect with those Indigenous communities, connect with the non-Indigenous communities, connect with the industry in the area, and get an understanding of who's in the forest and why. Is our community in the forest? Is it logging or oil and gas? What's going on in the forest and what needs to be protected? And how do we take preventative measures to make sure that is protected? How do we make sure that we have the best decision makers are the boots on the ground ones? And how do we protect them from liability? Because right now it comes down to liability. If you're a wildland firefighter, crew leader, or you're doing prescribed burns, you don't earn a ton of money. You do what you do because you love it, and you wear the liability for those prescribed burns. I mentioned the Banff crew is one of the best in the world, so they're also under a microscope. Banff had one prescribed burn just get a little bit out of control, and it's all over international headlines. Whereas I've been on Spreading Creek. That was a wildfire just up the road in between Banff and Jasper. That was a prescribed burn that went hundreds of hectares over. No one ever got the wrist slap for that because there's a different kind of tone to liability there. So I think protecting those boots on the ground decision makers from some levels of liability and then supporting them and empowering them to make salient decisions when the time is right and the context is right is really what we need to see. And, I know I'm talking to an MP here. I'm not talking to a provincial politician here, but I think that's where Parks has really a great opportunity to show how you can get it right.
But it sounds structurally like you mentioned that Banff is doing something well. So that's kind of a local management issue. And I guess one of the things that I was coming to understand through the conversations we had in Jasper were kind of the many different levels of decision making that are involved at national parks, because national parks by definition they're national parks, but there's still going to be local people with local understanding who can connect that local Indigenous knowledge with the needs of the community in the area, and that's true for redevelopment. It's also true for fire management. So, is this part of the challenge? Is decisions being made in Ottawa when people that are local maybe know more, and how much flexibility is there for local control of these kinds of decisions?
I would say to an extent. If anything, I would say actually the park system has the benefit of having one less layer of jurisdictional static as compared to provinces. Provinces, there's a lot of intricacies around who has jurisdiction over what land when it comes to their forest protection, whereas parks, they've got jurisdiction full stop, except for maybe around roads. Transport Canada might have that. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think the decisions that I've seen come out of Ottawa in relation to this don't necessarily threaten the ability to do these things, but more can be done to ensure that they do happen. As opposed to having support for Indigenous engagement and involvement that really is kind of like, for lack of a better term, kind of hollow. You can actually turn parks into, and the relationship with Indigenous communities into, okay, all right, we know we kicked all Indigenous peoples out 100 years ago, and Jasper is a reason why we're bringing them back in. And we're opening up this land to be stewarded in a way that is representative of what it actually is. If we're talking about conserving these beautiful lands and territories for future generations to enjoy, well, the fact of the matter is Canada, the Crown, Canada, has failed at that. Jasper is an example of that failure. So why not bring in the people who have been doing it for 14,000 years to show you how you actually do steward the land for generations and generations and maintain that spirit of parks? Having that support to do that also enables other places to look at them as an example of here's how you get it right. And with, the setup of the federal government being such that the three national Indigenous organizations are Section 35 and are federally linked, enables it such that there is that opportunity to that. So if you're asking me point blank, what's the kind of policy I'd like to see come out of Ottawa? Policy that secures long-term funding to do Indigenous fire stewardship or Indigenous stewardship activities in parks in relations with parks, because that's job creation, that's economic benefit in the prevention of emergency management or reaction to these things. There's a myriad of benefits that I think are bipartisan. Whereas,
but that would involve, from your perspective, people living in the park to a greater extent than is currently allowed. Indigenous people in particular.
I wouldn't necessarily.
Or not necessarily. Okay. I
mean, the way the reservation systems worked out, like let's take Banff, for example, that was the traditional lands, the Blackfoot, the Cree, the Stoney, I know I'm missing someone here, so please forgive me, but all those reservations, all those communities are still in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
Being Indigenous is your connection to the lands, waters, skies.
Right.
So those folks, they already are very excited to come back and partner into the parks and be part of that and have that education.
Yeah.
Sorry, give that education.
Okay. So that's fascinating. So it's, yeah, all right. It's not so much about coming to live there again, but it's about certainly re-engaging those communities and learning from what they know and supporting them to do that work. Is that happening now? What is the? I guess maybe we'll just conclude on this. Like, what do you see as kind of the likely present and future as this is developing? Are lessons being learned from what happened in Jasper around fire management, or is there a defaulting to kind of the way it's always been?
The fact that I've heard people say Jasper's unprecedented tells me that things aren't being learned, because they're saying Los Angeles is unprecedented the same way they said Lytton was unprecedented after they said Fort McMurray was unprecedented after they said Slave Lake was unprecedented. The lessons that are being learned the hard way by the people who actually have skin in the game, but they're not being learned by the politicians who hide behind the word unprecedented. It's like I said earlier, if you do the right thing, no one knows you did it. If no one knows you did it, how do you get reelected for it? But I think by opening this conversation up, I understand a politician's job is to get reelected, and they can have that too by developing these systems and championing them, and showing that Canada can be a leader in how we develop wildfire stewardship, wildfire management, wildfire forces, how we create jobs around this, how we protect economic flow around this. Think of the economic damage that was done from the park being shut down. We started this podcast by talking about the parks open up again. Imagine the park never had to close.
Yeah.
And there's jobs that are created for that year round. I think what I'm very heartened to hear here and see and experience in these spaces is academia, private industry, the insurance industry, Indigenous communities. Every time I'm at these tables speaking about these things, all of those groups are in agreement. More needs to be done on the preventative side. Indigenous fire stewardship is the best position to do that in an effective and efficient manner. And the reciprocal benefits of it and investing in that are quite remarkable. We're talking about actual truth and reconciliation. We're talking about job creation. We're talking about knowledge and science development that can be mobilized across the world. People say it's going to be expensive to employ wildland firefighters year round. Well, imagine if we were employing wildland firefighters year round that we could send down to California or Australia or wherever to be preventative there as well and spread this. I mean, there's a lot of ways to cook it. There's a lot of folks that have interested out there. I currently sit on the King Charles Wildfire Resilient Landscape Network. So, the King himself is interested in making sure that we can have successes in this. So it's definitely a sore point right now with seeing Los Angeles and Jasper and all these tragedies. But I think Canada, Alberta, Banff National Park are the best position to make the biggest impact and change in these spaces, and it's long overdue.
Yeah. Dane, thanks so much for taking the time to join me for this conversation. It's always been interesting for me hearing your perspective. I think you've appeared before parliamentary committees on this as well. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me, to other MPs. And I think people will be interested to see how philosophically laden these questions of fire management are. I had at one time thought it was purely a technical question, but you've shown us that there's some real richness and depth to the conversation around this. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much. And I really do appreciate the attention that you've given to this, Garnet. So thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dane. We are continuing this important conversation about the situation in Jasper with a discussion with another Dane. That is Dane Lloyd from the Conservative Caucus, our shadow minister who is responsible for I should have checked the title before we started, Dane, but emergency management or emergency preparedness, that sort of stuff. If you have an emergency, call Dane is the bottom line. So, Dane, thanks for joining us for kind of the second part of this conversation as we continue talking about the situation in Jasper, our Alberta Conservative Caucus retreat there. And you were central to making this happen. I wonder if you can share a little bit about your motivation in bringing all Alberta Conservative MPs to Jasper, and what were the key takeaways for you from those conversations?
Well, I'll start by saying thank you for having me on this podcast, Garnet. It's an honor to talk to your audience, and the Jasper situation, I think, hit all of us in Alberta, particularly those of us from northern Alberta, very hard. I mean, Jasper is an iconic destination in the summer, the winter. I mean, I grew up skiing in Marmot Basin. It's a place that's very close to my heart and many hearts in Alberta. The situation this past summer with the wildfire was so devastating for residents and workers in the town. They're still rebuilding today, and I think the town will be forever changed. Although it is our hope that we can recover and Jasper can be as great as it was, if not better. Going into January this year, it became clear that we as a Conservative caucus needed to take this opportunity to go to Jasper so we could get a firsthand account of what was going on the ground. We had over 20, I believe about 20 members of parliament in Jasper supporting the community, going out, meeting with stakeholders, the municipal council, Parks Canada, first responders, businesses, workers who were affected by the wildfire and the rebuilding this past summer. And I think it was a really important eye-opener to learn about, what are the issues that are still facing Jasper and what can we do to hopefully under a future Conservative government to help accelerate and support this iconic community through its rebuild.
Mm-hmm. So in the first part of this, the conversation really focused with Dane on the fire management, fire prevention, and some of the problems with the approach the government has taken up to now. So I want to get your quick kind of 2-minute reflections on that, but then we'll also get into talking about kind of the rebuild, the recovery, the future of Jasper, which is what you alluded to. How do we support this jewel, this iconic community within our province and our country on their important journey to recovery. But just first on the work, I know you've done a lot of work on the fire management issues as well. So what's your take on kind of the failures that led up to this fire and what could have been done differently?
Well, obviously everyone was devastated back in July when this fires took place, July of last summer, and we all came together to support the community during this trying time. But I think it's really important as members of parliament and especially serving in opposition to hold government accountable for their failures when they fail to act to take the measures needed to protect communities such as Jasper. And Jasper is really in a unique situation because it's in a national park. I mean, there's legislation, the National Parks Act, that governs what the municipality of Jasper, which itself is under the Alberta government, what it can and cannot do. And so there's a very unique interplay. It's not just like a community like in my area, Drayton Valley, which suffered fires 2 summers ago, which is clearly in the jurisdiction of the provincial government and the municipality. But in Jasper, it's a truly unique situation because, like Banff, it's in a national park. So there is a federal, provincial, and a municipal interplay there. What we saw, like my office and I, we were investigating. We were working with, retired forester who had been sounding the alarm for almost 10 years about the risk to Jasper, particularly this risk in the wake of the mountain pine beetle expansion. These mountain pine beetles are killing pine trees, and these dead stands of pine trees represented a huge fire risk. And we know that we've been having some very hot and very dry summers, and with strong winds, there's basically the perfect storm was set up for a devastating fire like we saw last summer. And it is really, only due to a couple of factors. I mean, one, the quick work of first responders, but also a very fortunate wind that the town of Jasper was saved from total destruction. So we need to prepare better. And what could have been done in the lead up, in the years leading up? Well, these retired foresters, Indigenous peoples who have, lived in this region for over a millennia, are telling us that allowing the forest to stand for over 100 years since the national park took over in the early 1900s, their fire suppression policies and lack of forest management really allowed this powder keg to just build and build and build to the point where when this fire got started, there was almost nothing that could be done to stop it.
Yeah, that's very important information. It's consistent with what we heard in the first half hour of this conversation. So, Dane, in terms of the kind of the response, the rebuild, and also just the management of Jasper in general, like one of the things that I really reflected on in the context of the caucus retreat we had and afterwards was the jurisdictional complexities that you just alluded to, right? It's the fact that making an area a national park is an expression of our collective commitment as a nation to recognizing this area, but it also brings with it a unique set of political dynamics. As you say, there's the municipality that cannot really make the same kind of decisions or have the same flexibility in making decisions that, say, another municipality outside of a national park could have. And that is a little bit of a challenge in the process of rebuilding, because you've got the different levels involved. So how do you see those challenges, and are there things that could be done to improve the kind of operating environment for the town of Jasper as they try to work through this?
So one key thing that I learned about during I hate to even call it a retreat, it was really a fact-finding mission to Jasper,
Yeah.
was that under an act of parliament, a federal act of parliament, the municipal boundaries of the town of Jasper are fixed. And so within the town of Jasper, under the authority of the municipality, they have very limited land. I mean, there's existing residential, but there's very little open serviceable land that is available for growth. And one thing we actually knew before the Jasper Wildfire is that there was zero vacancies in the town. There was not enough room for seasonal workers to live in the town. So there's this huge crunch, of lack of living space in the town of Jasper. And so that's really unique, because in the case of a municipality that's not in a national park, they can annex, neighboring counties' lands in order to expand if they need to. And that's very limited in the case of a community like Jasper as well. So when we're talking about, the provincial government had made this quite substantial promise of over $100 million. But in order to get that housing on the ground, you really needed land to be made available. And the town of Jasper and the federal government, they weren't making that much land available. And it's particularly about the type of housing. So people in Jasper understandably want denser housing because they have very limited land. The problem is I've spoken to the people who manufacture homes. You can't manufacture these multi-family homes in the time period that was needed to rehouse the people of Jasper. Like, it would take almost a year to build these homes, but you could build some single family detached homes. I was told back in January that they could be available by April. And so the provincial government was trying to provide funding to get these single family detached homes to the community. But then there was also some questions about what are we going to do with these single family detached homes after, people's homes are rebuilt and they move into them. And these are homes that are worth, hundreds of thousands of dollars to manufacture. There has to be a plan to repurpose those homes. And basically the talk in the town was that they wanted the houses to be taken out They wanted them removed because they were putting them on land that was, being used by the museum, or land that was being used for Indigenous sculptures or Indigenous art. And so they didn't want these houses to be on there permanently. And understandably, I think the provincial government was saying, well, why are we making over $100 million investment into houses that will last 50, 60 years when they're not going to be used for more than 3 years? And so this was created a conflict. And, since then I was speaking with the Red Cross, who has actually been tasked by the federal government to manage properties in Parks Canada territory. So there's some campgrounds outside of the town of Jasper that Parks Canada has made available, and they're moving in trailers for people to live in. So that's sort of the immediate short and medium term solution. Is the Red Cross is running these properties, these trailers that are being paid for by the federal government. So we're getting to a solution, but I think for a lot of people in Jasper, it's been pretty slow.
Right, and the slowness and the friction is because you've got these different levels of government with different rules or requirements. So just to sort of go through what you said, you've got a limited land allotment that's defined by federal statute, and then you've got people whose homes were destroyed. People need to live in the community. People also need to be able to live there in order to participate in the rebuilding. You need people to be there in order to do the work that's required for rebuilding. But you've got limited housing for people who are doing that work. And then the question is, what kind of temporary housing can you have? It takes more time to get the higher density in. If you're bringing single detached homes in, where are they going to go? How long are they going to be there? So there's a lot of different moving parts, but they're not moving parts that are all managed by the same group of people. You've got some moving parts that are controlled by the federal level, some at the provincial level, and then you've got the town trying to sort this out. Did you get a sense, kind of working through this issue, that we're still grappling with this problem of Ottawa thinks it knows best? And are there ways that, even in the case of parks that are national, you can have more decision making be in the hands of people that are on the ground, that know the local circumstances, and have more immediate familiarity with what the needs are?
Well, I think that's actually one of the first lessons that were learned coming out of the Jasper fire this past summer. I mean, actually, a bill that was immediately passed when Parliament returned in September was to actually devolve more responsibilities onto the municipalities from Parks Canada, and we supported that as Conservatives because that's what the town wanted, and we support devolving more responsibilities to the more local levels of government. These are responsibilities that I believe Banff already enjoys in many ways. So we need to ensure that the town has the capacity to be able to take on these responsibilities. And I think a big hit as well is their property taxes have taken a massive hit because a lot of these businesses and these residents, they can't be paying taxes when they're not able to operate and they're not able to live there. So I know there's been some property tax forgiveness from Parks Canada as well as from the Alberta government, which I think is really important. We also have to recognize that there's a huge time issue, right? Because there's sort of three classes of people that they are prioritizing. You've got the residents, of course, that need to live there. You have the temporary workers that are necessary, or the seasonal workers that are necessary to service the hotels and the restaurants. And then you have the construction workers who are absolutely necessary if you want to rebuild the town. And the trouble is that they're not able to get housing for all those people. And as we get into May, that's the season when tourists are starting to come back. And so they're going to be taking up hotel space. So now they're moving residents and temporary workers out of the hotels and construction workers to make way for tourists. And this is why it's so important that this get done in a timely manner. And so obviously, I think the town is really overwhelmed. Many communities at the best of times would be overwhelmed by the challenges they're facing. I think we need to possibly look at legislation. We heard from small businesses, for example. Here's an example of some of the red tape that I just think is ridiculous. They have Parks Canada has rules about the square footage that a hotel is allowed to have. So obviously they have their property that they're leasing. It's a certain amount of square footage. But many of these older hotels, that were built in the 60s and 70s, they had outdoor walkways. So you'd see like an old motel, it's not an indoor hotel where you have inner walkways. These outdoor walkways aren't counted towards their square footage. But in a modern hotel, they want to rebuild their hotels, they want these walkways to be inside because that's what the consumer wants. Well, that's counting towards their square footage now,
Right.
because they've taken the walkways from the outside to the inside. And so they're being told you can't make your rooms as large. We're cutting down on the amount of rooms that you can rebuild because they're limiting their square footage. And this is all because of an act of parliament. This is Parks Canada here. So I think, yes, we need to actually go through these regulations, ensure that they're actually meeting the needs of the community. We also have to respect it as a national park. We don't want to degrade a national park. We don't want to just pave over some beautiful, pristine areas. But we also have to recognize that, during this rebuild, that we can't rebuild it exactly the way it was. And that's not what the consumers right now want.
Yeah, totally. It seems, just picking up on that example, I mean, it just seems crazy to me that the federal government would be defining the square footage that you can have in a hotel in an existing defined footprint for the town. There's some logic in having some parameters around the footprint of the town because you don't want it to take over the whole park, right? But to say that even within that town footprint, you're reducing the number of rooms in the way you've described doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So that is a rule, just to clarify, that comes from the national requirements. Yeah,
it is. I mean, like this actually, and these are all important questions. But for me, with my focus on emergency preparedness, what I can never lose sight of is the fact that the town of Jasper is still at risk. The communities like Banff and Lake Louise are still at risk. And so what is being done? Are we taking the lessons from the foresters and the indigenous communities that are telling us that these stands of pine trees that have been killed by pine beetle are still at risk? So right now, it was interesting that people always thought, apparently, that it was going to be the west of the town that was going to be hit because there's lots of forest on the west of the town going towards British Columbia. And they thought that, based on the prevailing winds, that's where the fire was going to come from. So Parks Canada actually done some clearing immediately next to the town. But what we saw last summer was that the fire came from the south of the town, up the valley. And if you actually, when I was going skiing growing up, you're going up the hill. You and I took that bus tour. The entire hillside was all forest. You couldn't even see the valley, but it's all just toothpicks now. Like, it's all been burnt out. You can see the entire valley. So that whole south end is done, but we still have a major fire risk at the west end of town. So it's important that we see some of that selective logging, that we see replanting of trees that are more resilient to fire. I think that is critically important, like the Douglas firs, deciduous trees that are more resilient to fire, and ensuring that, that they're spaced out, that they have the fire breaks necessary to ensure that Jasper is not at risk this coming summer, because we don't know if it's going to be another dry summer, another hot summer like we saw, and we can't afford to let this happen again.
Yeah,
I think it was like almost $1 billion worth of insurable damage that hit the town of Jasper. I mean, we can't afford to keep letting this happen.
Yeah, those are really important points. That I think the way this happens is something, you have a major event like the fire last summer, and then it's in the news. People are talking about it. People are thinking about it, right? And then it goes out of the news because there are other situations or other things that get people's attention. But the problem persists. Maybe it's not solved, and we need leaders like you, like us in Parliament, to be able to kind of have this sustained attention to it, to say, how do we help the town rebuild, and also how do we make sure that these sorts of things don't happen again. So just to pick up on that aspect of the risk that's still there. are you seeing lessons be learned from what happened previously, from what happened last summer? I know you've facilitated some of these different experts coming to parliamentary committees and talking. Do you think the government is recalibrating their approach at all, or is it just kind of business as usual?
Well, I certainly hope that with the pounding that we've been giving him in Parliament, I know you were at the Environment Committee with me for some of the sessions. Like, we have been hitting this government hard on the issue of Jasper. I don't think they were expecting it this fall, but it's important because people say to me, why can't you guys just all work together? And I say it's like a competitive sports team. If you're a hockey team and you're an A-level hockey team and you're playing against like a weak hockey team and that's who you're practicing, you're never going to become better. And so I think it's critically important that we have a strong opposition to ensure that we have better government. So that's why we called them out. It's not because we take joy in doing it. It's because it's our duty to Canadians. So we called them out on Jasper. We hit them hard. And that's the only way we're going to see change. If we don't hit them hard, we don't call them out, we don't. I think actually visiting the community in January was really important. I think it sent a really strong message. I know the residents were really happy to see us there. It sends a strong message that we're not forgetting about the town, and we're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep asking questions. We're going to keep holding government and Parks Canada to account to ensure that we see the changes that we need to see. I think we need to have a better forest management strategy, particularly in our national parks. I think we need to cooperate more closely with our provincial governments that are adjacent to national parks, because it's ultimately, we heard that there were some issues about including the provincial government in the response center, in the emergency response center. We need to get the province in there right away. We need to get their resources available right away. And we need to have closer cooperation. We need to actually look at, what are the federal government's capabilities? The Emergency Preparedness Department is under Public Safety Canada. And one thing that I think is very interesting in the new cabinet that Liberal leader Mark Carney, the Prime Minister now, has put together, he actually eliminated the Emergency Preparedness cabinet position, and he's re-amalgamated it back into the Public Safety Ministry. Yep. So it's showing that, he's not giving as much importance to emergency preparedness as the previous prime minister did. But the fact is that even under the previous administration, there was no real standalone resources other than the Government Operations Center, which is a coordinating body. So I think we need to really look at, what do we think are federal, how can we address gaps? How can we complement existing provincial and municipal resources so that we can take action, so that we're not left, basically just handing out money, which is what has been the traditional federal response. How can we proactively support our partners in defending our communities from wildfires and other natural disasters?
Yeah, so fundamentally, a root and branch review of how the federal government does these things, with, it sounds like, a particular emphasis on identifying what those federal competencies actually are and listening better and giving power to folks at the local level, both on the fire prevention side, but also on the planning and rebuilding side.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then just on the rebuild too, like, it is striking to me, your description in terms of the people needs in the community right now. Because if Jasper was kind of crowded, bursting at the seams before the fire, and now the town actually needs more people because it needs to be able to accommodate the tourists and the people who live there and the seasonal workers, but on top of that, the construction workers who are doing the rebuild, that you have a town that was bursting at the seams that now actually needs more people to do the work that's required if it's going to keep going in the way that it has, if it's going to be able to welcome those tourists and keep being what it has been. Then you actually need more space for even more people than were accommodated before the fire. So that seems like a really kind of daunting challenge, and so important for the town to be able to continue to attract people, to continue to have that kind of flow of commerce. Because rebuilding the community, it's not just about the kind of physical work of rebuilding, right? It's about making sure people know that it's open and welcoming people back and being able to kind of keep that process unfolding. So that really puts in perspective kind of where we're headed coming into the summer season, both knowing the potential renewed fire risks, but also the challenges in terms of building.
Yeah, I mean, and we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I'm not saying, don't do the rebuild so we can focus on the wildfires. I think we have to be doing all these things at the same time, which requires a lot of resources and a lot of commitment and a lot of coordination.
Yeah. Are there, just in terms of that kind of people accommodation piece, it would seem that this is a challenge that maybe communities have dealt with before, communities that have been affected by fire that are also quite reliant on tourism. Are there other examples we can look to? But I guess maybe it's the national park issues that make it particularly challenging from a housing perspective.
Well, yeah, I know like a lot of people from Jasper, they're living in Hinton, Edson, they've gone to Edmonton. We've seen that like when Drayton Valley, which is also close by, a lot of people moved out to Stony Plains, Spruce Grove, and my riding. Fort McMurray, we had people in St. Albert and Edmonton, and as far down as Calgary. But yeah, it's a unique situation because of the national park, right? And people are getting tired. They want to go back home.
Mm-hmm.
They want to get back to their homes, and they're frustrated, understandably.
Yeah. So, so to bring it home, to coin a phrase, to bring it home, we need to lean in on protecting the community and on supporting the rebuild. Dane, thanks for your time today. I'll turn it back to you for the last word here. If there's any particular suggestions or solutions you want to leave with our listeners that they can talk to their local MPs about and push the government on, I'm glad through this episode we've been able to raise kind of awareness of the continuing challenge in Jasper. Also, to underline for people, as I said off the top, that Jasper is open, that Jasper is looking for tourists, people that can come and support the community by greasing the wheels of commerce and having a good time while they're there. But any other things you would like to leave with all of us in terms of what's important for helping Jasper out through the circumstances they're going to face in the next few months?
No, I think I want to reiterate the point that you just said. So, as much as we're talking about the housing shortage for residents and for seasonal workers and construction workers, I don't want to leave with your listeners with any impression that they shouldn't go to Jasper, because not all the hotel rooms are suitable for these medium to long term stays, and so a lot of these hotel rooms are empty, and these businesses need our support. And that's another reason why we went to Jasper, because in the winter it's a very slow season. You might think because it's a ski town that it's bursting at the seams. In the winter, it's very slow. I mean, in good years, they might break even. Businesses like hotels might break even. It's the summer season where they really make it. And of course, with last summer, with the fires in July, I mean, they lost months of their summer season. They lost their shoulder season in the early fall. So they're really playing catch up. And so I would encourage anyone who's watching this is make a plan, go to Jasper. I've been going to Jasper my whole life. And, there are some restaurants, I've gone to the Athabasca for breakfast. So that's a classic place. There are some really great new restaurants. There's great stores. The hotel, the Sawridge Hotel, which is now the Forest Park Hotel, which has been redone. There's some amazing things in Jasper. So if you think that the town of Jasper and it's the same old and there's nothing new there, I would highly encourage you to give it a second look, because it's a great place for families. There is a great cuisine culture. There's a great tourism culture. It's beautiful, and we need to support these local businesses, and especially with the situation that we're seeing with the United States and the perils of international and foreign affairs. Let's do our part as Canadians and support our local communities. And I can think of no community that's more deserving of our support right now than the community of Jasper, the people of Jasper, and all those businesses that are so desperate to rebuild. let's go out there and support them. Let's support them and enjoy ourselves, because it is a truly iconic jewel of this country, Jasper National Park. And you know what? We never know. We saw with the wildfires this past summer, things can change. And I know a lot of people are grieving those changes because it's never going to be quite the same. But it's still beautiful. It can take your breath away, even in the midst of the disaster that they faced. Let's get out there and support the town of Jasper. Get out there this summer.
Yeah, Dane, thank you. That's a great message. Get out there this summer. Get out there this spring too, right? It is a beautiful place, and thank you for the work you're doing on this.
I think spring skiing is still going on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been warm out in Alberta, but I think there's still some good snow up on the mountain.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, Dane, thanks for taking the time. Thanks to everybody for listening. I suspect that this will be our last episode before the start of the election. So I'll be communicating with you, our listeners and viewers, in other ways over the course of what is likely expected in the spring. And I anticipate we'll be back with more episodes of Resuming Debate once that whole thing is settled. So thank you, Dane. Thank you to both of the Danes we had on for a great conversation about a beautiful Alberta community that continues to need our support. If you like Resuming Debate, leave a review, and we'll be back with another episode, most likely once the election is over.